Sorry, the sun is really in my face. So our speaker today is Ismael García Colón. He is a historical and political anthropologist with a focus on the Gramscian concept of hegemony, oral history, immigration, and colonial migration, race, citizenship, farm labor, US empire, Puerto Rico, and US ethnic and racial histories. He teaches at the College of Staten Island and at the CUNY Graduate Center, which is where I was very lucky and fortunate to meet Ismael, and he has been great, very supportive of my work. His research experiences include documenting Latinx in the New York labor movement and landless workers, migrant farm workers, processes of colonial state formation, and land distribution programs in Puerto Rico. García Colón is the author of the book Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire, Puerto Rican Workers on US Farms, which we'll hear about today, and was just published in February of 2020. Another book that he's published is Land Reform in Puerto Rico, Modernizing the Colonial State, 1941 to 1969, and that was published in 2009. And his research explores the Puerto Rican experience in farm labor and its relation to US colonialism and immigration policies, and how government policies formed and transformed modern subjectivities in Puerto Rico. So I think it's really good to think with his work and the contemporary state of Puerto Rico and what's happening, especially in relation to this pandemic that we're all in, right? So how is Puerto Rico going to experience this? Well, we need to think about that long colonial history, immigration policies, right? So with that, I will turn it over. Thank you so much, Ismael, and I'm excited to hear your talk.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to the New York Boricua Resistance for this invitation. Like Lisa said, this presentation is about my book, and my book is basically about the long history of Puerto Rican farm labor migration to the United States. The Puerto Rican experience in US farm labor challenges our understanding of citizenship in relation to immigration policies, national immigration policies. Farm labor migration reveals how Puerto Ricans occupy a complicated status within the US nation. Puerto Ricans confront questions about their citizenship in everyday encounters with North Americans and immigrants. Since 1898, the UN's invasion of Puerto Rico has complicated North American perceptions of Puerto Ricans. Even after 1917, when the United States granted citizenship to the inhabitants of Puerto Rico, mainstream US societies has always suspected us of being illegal aliens. Of course, illegal aliens within quotes. Our designation as colonial subjects, mixed racial backgrounds, Latin American culture, and Spanish speaking marked us as different in a nation state where being a white Anglo-Saxon embodied a dominant notion of citizenship. So over 100 years, Puerto Rican migration has generated this confusion. What are Puerto Ricans, citizens, immigrants? What are we? So last year, I decided to ask my students at the College of Staten Island if they thought that I was an immigrant or a migrant. An immigrant meaning an international migrant, and versus a migrant or meaning an internal migrant. And most of them agreed that I was an immigrant. And I asked why, and they said, well, because you have an accent, English is not your first language, and because you don't look American. So what does that mean, to look American? Because I guess because I'm not white or because I'm not African American. I think that's what they meant, right? However, this confusion is not only shown by CSI students or even students at the Graduate Center. Scholars of immigration, or rather international migration, usually complicate rather than clarify the status of Puerto Ricans. You can find books of international migration where they mention Puerto Ricans. And even scholars of Puerto Rican contribute to this confusion by referring to Puerto Ricans as international migrants or immigrants. But the problem is not just about if Puerto Rican migration is internal or international migration. The problem with all the literature that has been written that includes Puerto Rican is a failure to acknowledge that Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States and that Puerto Rican migration is a migration of colonial subjects. Thus, my book seeks to clarify this confusion and their effects on Puerto Rican migration. Employment-related cases illustrate the complexities of Puerto Ricans' role in U.S. farm labor. In 2015, the U.S. Department of Labor announced charges against a farm in New Jersey for unlawfully rejecting Puerto Ricans who had applied for employment, and they didn't give the job to Puerto Ricans, but they actually hired guest workers. And this is in violation of the regulations of the H-2A visa program. The H-2A program requires farmers to hire first domestic workers, meaning citizens, including Puerto Ricans, right? Before they hire workers from other countries. Like in this case were Mexicans and usually Jamaican workers. Because many agricultural employers view Puerto Ricans as a problem because the US citizenship, this type of incidents have become more common where the farmers don't want to hire Puerto Rican workers just because they are or we are citizens. Two cases illustrate how employers' ability to deport guest workers and undocumented workers shapes the agricultural labor market. In 2016, Latino Justice filed a case before the U.S. Equal Opportunity Commission against a Michigan apple grower for discriminating against and firing a group of Puerto Rican workers in favor of Mexican workers. And the issue here is that it's not that I want just the farmers to give preferential treatment to Puerto Rican. The problem in this case is that the farmers prefer workers that can be deported because they can be more exploited. That's the whole problem here. So the same thing happened in New York in 2018. So this is very common, and this is part of the history of Puerto Rican farm labor migration. Farm labor migration continues to the present as a result of the economic crisis, debt, austerity, and Hurricane Maria. Immigration restrictions are making Puerto Ricans more attractive to low-wage industries in landscaping, hotels, and food processing. Employers have landed in Puerto Rico looking for workers. So at the same time that Puerto Ricans don't want to be hired by some employers because they cannot be deported, other employers are now taking advantage the fact that Puerto Ricans don't have jobs to go to Puerto Rico to recruit them as workers. In January 2017, some dairy farmers in South Dakota expressed interest in hiring Puerto Ricans, but state officials and some farmers were skeptical, arguing that migrants could leave their jobs easily and return home because they do not depend on visas. One official added that US workers, quote, are not hungry enough, unquote, to remain in this type of jobs, meaning that the workers need to be hungry to remain in farm jobs that are going to exploit them. At the same time, prejudice against Puerto Ricans in the States continues because of the perception that Puerto Ricans are foreigners. The nightly news still reports incidents of discrimination and labor exploitation and complaints about the fate of migrants. Events highlighted in social media show Puerto Ricans targeted by nativists for speaking Spanish and rejection of the Puerto Rican government's IDs. The nativist, racist, and nationalist climate unleashed by the election of Donald Trump intensified the openness and severity of such incidents. Puerto Rican experienced discrimination on the streets and in jobs, stores, and government offices because of their names and accents or because they are heard speaking Spanish. As my book shows, again, this is an ongoing story. It is part of my experience in the United States, and I'm sure of many of you, and is part of my experience in the classroom at CSI and at the CUNY Graduate Center. Remember the incident that happened with the lawyer in April of 2018, that he began insulting a deli worker and a customer in Manhattan. So the customer was Puerto Rican in that case, and the daily worker was from Central America. This quote is from 1927, and it's an example of the same kind of sentiment that is happening now against Puerto Rican migrants. After Puerto Ricans became US citizens in 1917, farmers in California and the Southwest feared that Mexicans would be replaced by Filipinos and Puerto Ricans. An official of the Fruit Growers of California argued that, quote, the Puerto Rican Negro is a thin-lipped Negro and is not efficient as the Mexican. We cannot handle them like Mexicans. A Puerto Rican has much right to state as we have. He cannot be deported as can a Mexican. The Mexican can be deported if they become county charges, but the others are here to stay, unquote. So farmers fear that Puerto Ricans could contest by violations of their rights or become a burden for welfare agencies. So there's this constant fear, right, in the history of Puerto Rican migration, of Puerto Rican being dependent on welfare, and that fear comes from the fact that they became citizens in 1917. Even the congressional hearings on immigration from 1928 showed that fears with farmers complaining against the hiring of Puerto Ricans and the rejection or the United States closing the doors to Mexican workers. But Puerto Ricans were never really a threat to Mexican migration or the Mexican Bracero program that the government of the United States had during the Second War. Few in number compared to Mexican braceros, Puerto Rican nevertheless constituted more than 60,000 farm workers per year at the peak of their migration during the late 1960s and early 1970s. Contract Puerto Rican farm labor migration concentrated on the Northeast from Maine to Maryland, from the north to the south Maryland, and to the Midwest, from the Northeast to the Midwest, to the states of Wisconsin and Illinois. So I do this, or I did this research departing from historical anthropology. I conducted archival research and oral histories in order to understand over time the formation of Puerto Rican farm workers. I argued that the US guest workers programs, immigration and deportation policies, colonialism, and citizenship shaped the flows of Puerto Rican farm labor migration. Because we are citizens, we don't think as that immigration policies affect us. But in the case of Puerto Rican farm labor migration, there's a direct correlation between the policies of immigration of the United States government and the migration of Puerto Rican farm workers. So what are the ideas that I use to understand this migration? The first issue is called US colonialism. And US colonialism is one of the most important forces that fostered Puerto Rican migration. And when I talk about colonialism, I am referring to what anthropologist Eric Wolf says about the concept of structural power. He says, quote, structural power is the power that not only operates within the settings of or domains, but also organizes and orchestrates the settings themselves, and that specifies the distribution and direction of energy flows, unquote. So what does that mean? That means that a specific US colonial policies, legal decisions, and actions transform the migrants' field of action by incorporating Puerto Ricans into the US labor market. In 1988 with the US invasion of Puerto Rico. With the invasion and Puerto Rico becoming part of the United States, migration expanded the horizons of occupational, political, social, and educational opportunities for a population suffering economic distress caused by the invasion and colonialism. So when I talk about colonialism, I'm not necessarily talking about this top-down process where the United States is an entity oppressing Puerto Ricans, but colonialism is something that is also from the bottom up. Is the Puerto Rican officials inserting themselves in the sphere of the federal government to transport Puerto Rican farm workers to facilitate this kind of migration. I also use Natalie Potts and Nicolas de Genova idea of the immigration regime and the immigration and deportation regime. They argued that, quote, the deportation is in fact the expression of a complex social-political regime that manifests and engenders dominant notions of sovereignty, citizenship, public health, national identity, cultural homogeneity, racial purity, and class privilege, unquote. A deportation regime creates subjectivities of naturalized, immigrant, foreign, and illegal denizens. This means that immigration policies in the United States also create definitions of who are citizens, right? And who are we gonna consider citizens with full rights? And in the case of Puerto Ricans, of this deportation regime have shaped Puerto Ricans as colonial citizens of the United States. The deportability status of a large part of farm workers rendered domestic workers, including Puerto Ricans, as undesirable for US agriculture. This book is also, it's about the policies of the government, but it's also about the agency of migrants, how the migrants maneuver through these fields of power. Like Jose Cruz argues, Puerto Ricans were the ones that made the decisions to leave and took seriously the promises of American citizenship. Of course, you take decisions, but within the forces that are shaping your life. And in the case of Puerto Rican, the lack of jobs and the policies that the government was implemented shaped the decisions that they took, the decision to migrate to farm labor. So the first part of my book is about the administrative and legal processes and outcomes that induced attempts to manage labor migration. Using these theoretical approaches, I studied the Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program that began in 1947 and ended in 1993. The Puerto Rican Farm Labor Program placed workers in more than 400,000 farm jobs during this period of time, indirectly fostering the migration of thousands of non-contract workers and the emergence of many stateside Puerto Rican communities. In 1947, the government of Puerto Rico established Public Law number 25 that established the Bureau of Employment and Migration and its Migration Division. These agencies under the Puerto Rico Department of Labor. And the role of the Bureau was to oversee the flow of this migration and try to manage this, the migration of Puerto Ricans. The government of Puerto Rico also passed Public Law 89 in 1947, which restricted labor contractors from recruiting Puerto Ricans without authorization from the Puerto Rico Department of Labor, meaning that labor recruiters, private labor recruiters, could not go to Puerto Rico without a permission from the government of Puerto Rico to recruit workers. And this Puerto Rico Farm Labor Program was influenced by what they call the Bracero programs from the 1940s to the 1960s. The program hired, transported, and oversaw the work of migrant farm workers in the United States. The Bureau had offices in Puerto Rico and throughout the United States, in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Camden, Hartford, Chicago, and Cleveland, just to mention some of them during this period of time. And let me see. So the Bureau also produced literature about how to hire agricultural workers, promoting the farm labor program among US growers. It issued a contract, and actually it forced growers to abide by this contract that was bilingual with tiny, tiny, tiny letters that I'm sure you cannot read right now. And they were really difficult for workers to read when they not were illiterate, right? Because at that time, a large part of the rural population in Puerto Rico was illiterate. And there were many, many misunderstandings with this contracts. This is a photo of Puerto Ricans in an airplane that the government of Puerto Rico leased to transport workers to the farms. And these were cargo airplanes that the government of Puerto Rico had purchased, had leased, I'm sorry, after the war. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. These were cargo airplanes that were military surplus that were supposedly equipped to transport workers. And you can see how they were equipped with this, they look like those yard seats where they were carrying the workers. And this is a group of workers arriving in the airport of Buffalo, New York, 1948. And because of this confusion about what Puerto Ricans are, the government of Puerto Rico issued booklets trying to teach North Americans that Puerto Ricans were citizens, and so they could not be deported. So the hiring of migrant Puerto Rican farm workers in the United States at different historical moments has depended on their legal status within the US nation, illustrating the intersection of colonialism, citizenship, and immigration in these processes. After Puerto Rico became a US territory in 1898, the United States allowed Puerto Ricans into the labor market by defining them as nationals with limited rights. As US nationals, they migrated to Hawaii, Cuba, and other regions on the periphery of the US empire. Colonial labor migration became an option for US sugar corporations trying to avoid restrictive immigration laws, such as the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Foreign Act. Both laws restricted contract labor migration from outside the United States. Since Puerto Ricans as colonial migrants could not be deported, many local officials and residents still objected to their migration. So you have Puerto Ricans going to, from 1898, if you look at the table, from 1898 to 1917, migrating to Hawaii, Cuba, even Mexico, Ecuador, Panama, and they were hired by US companies. And most of them were migrating outside the continental United States. Of course, they were migrating because of the economic conditions that were in place in Puerto Rico by the US colonial regime of that time. If you take a look from 1917, 1941, Puerto Ricans became US citizens, but not birthright citizens. The citizenship of Puerto Rican was a naturalized citizenship, like any immigrant that naturalizes in the US and becomes a US citizen. It wasn't until 1941 that changed, and Puerto Ricans became native-born, considered native-born US citizens. So the US Department of Labor began to recruit Puerto Ricans as workers for war-related industries in 1918. In the 1920s, Arizona growers hired Puerto Rican workers, ending the project in a total disaster due to migrants not willing to accept the living and working conditions and leaving for the cities. And the quote that I mentioned before from 1927 is actually the product of the failure of agricultural growers to hire Puerto Ricans. They promised Puerto Ricans many things that they didn't fulfill, and Puerto Ricans began to protest, write letters to Puerto Rico complaining about their situation. And it was a disaster, and that's why Puerto Ricans were not good workers, because they were not willing to accept those working conditions.
Ismael, sorry, Ismael, could we take a quick break? There's a few questions
Yes.
that have been coming in, so I don't know if we can just take a quick break to answer some of those. So in the chats, the first question was around the term colonial citizens. And the question is, are there others who would fall into that category? What construes that definition? Would original nations and descendants of slavery also be considered under that same definition?
That's a good question. Colonial citizens, yes, I mean, because they are, Puerto Ricans are not the only case in the world of a population that inhabits a territory, a colonial territory, and they are granted citizenship. You have now, for example, populations of Koreans that were formerly colonial subjects of Japan, and now they live in Japan and they're still not full citizens. You have descendants of Algerians that were part of France. Algeria was part of France before independence, and Algerians were migrating to France. So throughout history, you have these cases of colonial migrants and colonial citizens. In the case of Filipinos, the Filipinos were national migrants like Puerto Ricans, but Filipinos lasted until independence, until they became independent as US nationals. You have, in the case of Guam, they are also colonial citizens. You have Samoans that are still US nationals, colonial migrants, the Samoans that migrate to the United States. So throughout history and to the present, you have colonized people throughout the world with the same status of Puerto Ricans.
Thank you. The next question was, what did those labor contracts consist of? Were there any people within the Puerto Rican agricultural department that were looking out for the people by reading them and making sure they understood what they were signing? And if there weren't, did people within that department stand to gain any benefits? So any people from within the Puerto Rican agricultural department, did they also have any benefits from the Puerto Rican workers signing those labor contracts?
So the program wasn't run by the Puerto Rico Department of Agriculture. It was run by the Puerto Rico Department of Labor, and the department was the one that issued the contracts and negotiated the contracts with the farmers. And the officials, when they recruited the workers had to be willing to sign those contracts, even when they were illiterate. So the officials were supposed to read the contracts. But I mean, this is something that it is the official thing that happened, right? In practice, they the workers signed the contracts without really understanding what they were doing. And in some cases, the Puerto Rico Department of Labor, through its migration division, had field agents throughout the United States, overseeing the farm workers, visiting them in the labor camps. And sometimes the farmers were friends with these field workers, and the field agents will not denounce or get the farmers into trouble because they were too friendly with them, and they actually worked in favor of the farmers. In other cases, it was the opposite. I mean, the field agents were really trying to protect the rights of workers. But I will say that in the majority of cases, because these field agents work for the government of Puerto Rico, the interest was not to cause problems for the government of Puerto Rico. So any kind of bad publicity or problem with workers would cause problems for the government of Puerto Rico. So the government of Puerto Rico always intervened in any problem that the workers had, just trying to keep peace and not to avoid generating bad press.
Gotcha. Thank you. And the last question so far for now is, can you briefly explain what, if anything, changed in terms of legal status in 1952? So I think they're asking the legal between the naturalized and the birthright.
Yes, yes. So I guess I can continue, right? So let me continue and I can explain that.
Absolutely.
So by 1941, Congress revised the nature of US citizenship of Puerto Ricans. The Naturalization Act of 1940 defined Puerto Ricans as native-born citizens, which led to more intense lobbying by colonial officials from Puerto Rico for their inclusion in wartime efforts to sustain US agricultural production. And using the Mexican bracero as a model, as I mentioned, the Puerto Rican government established the Bureau of Employment and Migration during this time. And these agencies developed a contract system to manage the migration and hiring the farm workers on the mainland. In the 1950s, migrants were further integrated into the US labor market through amendments to the Wagner-Pacer Act of 1933. The Wagner-Pacer Act, what it created in the United States in 1933 during the Great Depression, was an interchange labor system, which will send workers from areas of what they call surplus employment, where there were many jobs available but few workers. So it will send workers from areas that didn't have jobs to these areas with a lot of employment opportunities. It was a way to manage of unemployment during the Great Depression. So the Wagner-Pacer Act is not established in Puerto Rico until 1950. And with that, Puerto Rico then became fully integrated to the US Department of Labor and this federal job exchange system. In 1952, with the Immigration and Naturalization Act, Puerto Ricans are included in the act. The act has one of the visas is the H-2 visa, and that eventually became what is known now as the H-2A, but in 1952 was the H-2 visa, and it was to allow farmers to bring these guest workers. But so the act basically officialized the fact that Puerto Rican had to be considered as domestic workers before hiring any guest workers. There was intense resistance from some farmers, but the government of Puerto Rico, aided by labor organizations and activists, lobbied the federal government to recruit Puerto Rican workers. U.S. Senator Dennis Chavez from New Mexico submitted legislation and advocated on behalf of Puerto Rican workers during this period of time. In 1951, during the hearings for the Federal Security Agency appropriations, Chavez scolded the U.S. Secretary of Labor, Maurice Tobin, for not fostering the use of Puerto Rican workers. He said, quote, "We have conference here on Pan-Americanism and on this and that, but we neglect to do anything about giving work to our own Puerto Rican citizens who are willing to die, and some do die for their country," meaning the United States, not Puerto Rico, of course. Just because we want to import some workers from Jamaica or Mexico or elsewhere, it is a little beyond my comprehension, unquote. Despite these advances, officials regularly confronted employers opposed to hire Puerto Ricans because, again, they could not be deported. It's like this complaint, you know, to the present time, particularly after the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1952. Let me show you. So in the case of, this is the case of the shade tobacco growers that had to hire, was forced by the U.S. Department of Labor to hire Puerto Rican workers. And they say that they prefer workers that could be controlled, and that Puerto Ricans could not be controlled because they were citizens. Because hiring Puerto Rican farm workers depended on limiting how many guest workers entered the United States, the number of workers hired under the farm labor program increased substantially when the Bracero program ended in 1964. If you take a look at this graph, I don't know if you can see my cursor. So the peak, you know, it's basically the same number of workers until 1964, where it increases by 1969. There are more than 20,000 contract Puerto Rican workers migrating under the Puerto Rico Department of Labor. So the first part of my book is about this legal administrative attempts to manage this migration. So the second part is more about the development of this farm labor program and the experiences of migrant workers. The intensive modernization and migration policies of the government of Puerto Rico were producing a new common sense about migrants' expectations and life in the United States. A new way of life. When I talk about common sense, it's about a new way of life in which migration was central to Puerto Ricans. So, and still now, migration is something that is part of the Puerto Rican experience, not only in the United States, but in Puerto Rico. the farm labor program made Puerto Ricans aware of the challenges of learning English, food, low-wage jobs, higher standard of living in the United States as compared to Puerto Rico, housing, racial relations, employer expectations, and conditions in the labor camps. This is an example of Sidney Mintz is an anthropologist, was an anthropologist, and he studied Puerto Rico in the late 1940s and 1950s. And this is part of his field notes. And he talks about basically how people were expressing themselves about their experiences about migration and their complaints. And he mentions that you know, allá hace un tremendo frío. Over there, it's cold. That people couldn't work all the time. That the workers had to cook their own meals. That the meals were not good. So the impersonal relationship with some farmers were another source of complaint for the migrants. Migration attracted men who were open to adventure and who wanted an alternative in the desperate efforts to find keep a job in Puerto Rico. But this wasn't easy for them to leave their families and venture to the United States. In my interviews with migrants, they expressed hope for improving their living conditions. I interviewed workers in 1907 throughout 2013 that had began migrating in the late 1950s, and they were still migrating. And they were telling me that, you know, they initially migrated because they wanted to improve the life of their families, to send their children to college. But after more than 50 years there, they were still migrating and doing the same kind of job. Many workers were able to save money, build houses, bring their families, and educate their children. They also expressed the feelings of estrangement that they experienced living in the labor camps and working nonstop, in many cases 60 hours or more per week. This is why they often refer to living in the labor camps as living in prison-like conditions. And this is another constant topic that they mentioned in the interviews, that they felt like living in a prison. And it's because, you know, they work for so many hours a week. They were not a slave, but they worked many hours like slaves, at least slaves in legal terms, right? They were not a slave legally. This is a photo of the Glassboro labor camp from the 1950s. And this Glassboro is in southern New Jersey. The labor camp was the largest labor camp that housed Puerto Rican workers. More than 500 workers lived in Glassboro. It was repaired and built in part with funds of the government of Puerto Rico and the government of New Jersey. Southern New Jersey is still the center of Puerto Rican farm labor migration to the United States. It began as the center and is still the center of that migration. This is how the interior of the camps looked in 1948, and I have seen camps to the present time when I was doing research that looked similar, the same time of bed, and they look very similar inside. This is the barracks. When the barracks tends to be, of the labor camps tend to be this building that are hidden from the roads, and you don't usually know that the farm workers live there until you visit them, and then you learn to identify the barracks in the farms. So this is from 2013, so it's very similar. The building's still very similar. And in some cases, it are the same buildings from the 1950s. And sometimes the worker complained because there were chicken coop that they transformed into labor camps, and the odor of manure, and it was very difficult for them to sleep in this barracks. This is a photo of 1948 where the officials of the government of Puerto Rico were visiting farm workers. And this is a letter of a farm worker. Even when many had positive experiences, migrants' complaints against farmers were continuous and everlasting. In 1958, a worker wrote to the government of Puerto Rico stating, quote, "It seems that the general belief of Americans is that the worker in the camp is their own toy, which they can play with at their will, making false promises, having them waste their time. Others like me have seen them, and I can say that has happened. Take a Puerto Rican by the neck and shake him, and later, with the help of the police, throw him and his luggage outside without cause. Are the government of Puerto Rico and the United States paying employees to sit in an office and do nothing for the worker? Is it just that the Puerto Rican is useful only when there is a problem, be that a war or the possibility of losing the harvest? It should not be like this, because we are as much citizens and as those born here. Well, were born here in American territory, and we under the American flag. There are many abuses committed against Puerto Rican citizens in the camps. There are so many that one of these days we will have to protest," unquote. Workers indeed protested whenever employers and government officials did not meet their expectation or failed to carry out their promises. Like in this case, in the town of North Collins, in 1966, migrants protested against segregation and police brutality in the town. And they were threatening to burn the village of North Collins. Of course, it was just a threat. They had the Molotov cocktails ready, but it was just a way to show that they felt angry. I don't think they were really planning to do it, but they were threatening to burn the village. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, when contract farm labor migration, remember the graph, increases, activists and workers began to organize labor organizations. The Asociación de Trabajadores Agrícolas, the Agricultural Workers Association, is established in the 1970s in Connecticut among tobacco workers. And Eventually, they seek the help of the United Farm Workers Union, led by Chavez. But these efforts are contained or eliminated because farmers stopped hiring Puerto Ricans. Farmers went to the courts. The courts declared that the contract of the government of Puerto Rico was made Puerto Ricans not available for U.S. agriculture, that the contract was a burden for farmers, while the workers complained about the wages and the conditions of the contract. Show you. In the 1970s, opal growers who preferred guest workers began also to complain about Puerto Rican workers. They argued that Puerto Ricans didn't know how to pick apples, that they didn't have the skills to pick apples, that racially Puerto Ricans were not prepared to pick apples, that they prefer British West Indians because they were tall and they could pick apple better than Puerto Ricans that were short. But I also have seen complaints about vegetable farmers saying that Mexicans were better because they were shorter than Puerto Rican workers to harvest vegetables. So, you know, there you go. When they want to justify and find an excuse not to hire Puerto Rican and basically secure a labor source that is cheap and deportable, they find the ways to justify. Let's see. So in the 1970s, there were, in 1980s, there are new efforts to organize workers. The Agricultural Workers Committee, or Comité de Apoyo a los Trabajadores Agrícolas, is established in southern New Jersey. And the CATA, as is known, is still works organizing and helping farm workers in southern New Jersey. So from the early 1970s through the early 1990s, migrant workers maneuvered with a social field dominated by guest work, neoliberalism, and free trade. Legal battles between labor activists, workers, and the government of Puerto Rico and growers shaped new regulations for the use of rejections of Puerto Ricans in U.S. farm labor. The refusal to hire Puerto Rican workers increased when intense labor organizing among tobacco workers was happening. This sentiment came to a head when apple growers refused to employ Puerto Ricans, leading to legal challenges to both growers and the farm labor program. In Puerto Rico, the Rosselló González administration ended the farm labor program in 1993, a year before the United States became part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Thereafter, Mexican migration exploded as large growers and associations began to replace Puerto Rican with Mexican workers. Colonial neoliberalism had finally succeeded in eliminating the Puerto Rico farm labor program. And to conclude, I mean, the first issue that I want you to keep in mind from this presentation is that we need to think Puerto Rican migration as colonial migration. That, I mean, immigration scholars should not discriminate, compare the experience of colonial migrants with those of immigrants without looking also at the distinctiveness of their experience. Yes, we can compare colonial Puerto Rican migration to Mexican migration, but it's not the same because Puerto Ricans are colonial migrants. You can compare the migration of Tejanos in farm labor to Michigan, right? To the migration of Mexican Americans from the territories that were conquered by the United States to other parts of the United States, to the migration of Puerto Ricans, because it's similar. But we need to be, we need to make that distinction that of Puerto Ricans being colonial migrants. Second, that immigration policies and guest worker programs shape Puerto Rican migration, even though Puerto Ricans are US citizens. We think that these immigration policies of the United States don't affect us, but they shape the migration of Puerto Rican. And I'm not arguing that Puerto Ricans should have preference over guest workers or undocumented workers, or that undocumented workers, guest workers are taking jobs that could go to Puerto Ricans. Actually, what I'm arguing is that all farm workers need to have the same rights. They need to have a minimum wage. They need to have access to housing. That the level, the conditions should be the same for all farm workers. Third, I argued that, and for you that read about Puerto Rican social science and migration, you always hear how people talk about transnationalism. But in my opinion, transnationalism obscures the understanding of Puerto Rican farm labor migration, the use of transnationalism to understand Puerto Rican migration. It is colonialism rather than transnationalism what explained why Puerto Rican workers were hired for US farm, how the government of Puerto Rico was able to insert themselves within the US government, right? Within the US Department of Labor, because Puerto Rico is a colony. The Mexican government could not do this with the braceros, but the Puerto Rican government could do it. And in this way, send all the surplus population to the United States. The government of Puerto Rico knew that they could not provide workers with jobs in manufacture when they were industrializing Puerto Rico. So the alternative was to send Puerto Ricans through this farm labor program. And it was because colonialism. Transnationalism doesn't explain that. It doesn't explain why Puerto Ricans were in Hawaii at the beginning of the 20th century. So we need to keep that in mind. The history of Puerto Rican migration is better understood when we examine the experiences of other migrants, like I mentioned the Tejanos, Native Americans in reservations migrating to farm labor, Filipinos working in agriculture in the United States, rather than using this approach of transnationalism. And the fourth issue is that the task to understand Puerto Rican migration must be comparative. One needs to look at the intersection of race, immigration, and citizenship, like the people in Chicano, the scholars in Chicano studies have done, and look at other examples of colonial migration throughout the world. And finally, the status of Puerto Ricans as US colonial subjects reveals the complexity of the definitions and practices of who is a citizen and who is an immigrant in the 21st century United States. looking at the formation of the colonial state and citizenship through the lens of immigration policies demonstrate that the role played by Puerto Ricans in the formulation, or demonstrate the role played by Puerto Ricans in the formulation of US labor policy. The problems of Puerto Ricans in the US labor market are not those of lack of assimilation. Puerto Ricans' understanding of culture and identity are not an obstacle to social mobility. Rather, inequalities and powers have shaped their migration. Immigration policies are part of how a state organizes these inequalities, shaping not only the lives of immigrants, but also the lives of citizens and colonial subjects. Despite enduring challenges, migration remains an alternative for many Puerto Ricans to survive in a colonial regime devastated by economic crisis, government debt and corruption, policies of austerity, Hurricane Maria, the recent earthquake, and who knows, with the effects of the coronavirus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ismael. This was so great. We learned so much. We just have a few more questions from the chat that are coming in from both Facebook, IG, and the chat here. So the first question, the first two questions I'm gonna try to bring together because I think they're very similar. And they're more around the relationships of Puerto Rican migrants with other nationalities who are also competing. Was there, I guess one of the questions is, what were the tensions between some of those nationalities? And also if there was any solidarity between those nationalities as well. And there was a specific question around not just the Puerto Ricans that came to the US, but also those who went to other places like Cuba, Jamaica, and those other areas.
Any specific about those migrations, or?
They just the same question, just around the tensions and any solid, like what was some of the maybe discrimination they may have faced in those areas that were outside of the US?
We also always have to think about who is making workers compete and why, right? And the answer is that it's farmers, employers, elected officials, because they need to exploit workers, right? And that's why they create myth against about how some workers are better than others. And in the case of Puerto Ricans, there's always a history of tension, right? With Mexicans, West Indians, Jamaicans, but there are also stories of solidarity. I remember going to this labor camp in Southern New Jersey and meeting this Mexican, and he was so eager to talk to me and say that he eats with the Puerto Ricans. He basically behaves like the Puerto Rican workers. And there were many non-Puerto Rican workers that lived in the labor camps. They were, when the workers began to be organized in the late 1960s and 1970s, most of them are Puerto Ricans, but not exclusively Puerto Ricans. One of the principal organizers that established CATA is a Cuban American. So the solid, and before CATA, ATA, the Agricultural Workers Association, tried to find, make an alliance with the United Farm Workers Union. So there are definitely these solidarities. There are histories of Puerto Ricans being racist against West Indians too. There are histories of Puerto Ricans being part of crews of workers that are mainly composed of African Americans. In the migrant stream in the eastern coast of the United States, usually from workers used to migrate, trek from Florida to the Northeast and go back to the harvest. You know, they will go harvesting first in Florida, from Florida, North Carolina, and so on until they will get to New York or even Maine. And so some of those groups of farm workers were mainly African Americans, and there were always a few Puerto Ricans. Puerto Rican had married African Americans. In many of the farming communities, Puerto Rican farm workers married African Americans or whites. In the area of Buffalo, in the area of North Collins, there's the Seneca Native American reservation. And many Puerto Rican farm workers married Native Americans. And when I went to visit Buffalo, this Puerto Rican restaurant owner would tell me that this Native Americans will come to eat in his restaurant with last name like Rodriguez, Hernandez, Rivera. And these were the children or grandchildren of Puerto Rican migrant farm workers. And because the Seneca are a matriarchal society, they are Native Americans, they are not Puerto Ricans. In terms of the other migrations, because I haven't studied them deeply, I don't know so much about the solidarities, but there was always this connections and networks between labor organizers in the sugarcane in Puerto Rico and places like in Cuba. So I imagine that there was a back and forth among with news and aid from Puerto Rican sugarcane workers in Cuba and back in Puerto Rico. In the case of Hawaii, it's interesting because the US sugar growers bring the Puerto Ricans to Hawaii because the Chinese Exclusion Act doesn't allow to bring them Chinese. The Japanese are dominated at that time. They were the majority of workers, so they were able to basically bargain and establish their wages. They had bargaining power with the growers. So the growers, to break that power of the Japanese workers, they bring Portuguese, they bring Puerto Rican workers. And there were always conflicts, imagine, between the Japanese and the Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Ricans are taken to Hawaii with whole families, different from the Japanese. It's interesting because during the Second War, when the Japanese are sent to camps, the Japanese are allowed to decide if they want to go to labor camps in agriculture. Some of them are sent to New Jersey. Some of those Japanese were actually Peruvian Japanese, because there's a large community of Japanese descendants in Peru. And Puerto Ricans and this Japanese Puerto Rican, or the Puerto Ricans, are actually sent also to southern New Jersey to work in agriculture, and they live and work with this Japanese Peruvian. And I always had, I always said, I'm sure a Puerto Rican married a Japanese or vice versa. And just Googling in the internet, I found this story of this woman that was half Japanese and half Puerto Rican because their parents met in this labor camp in southern New Jersey.
Thank you very much. That I guess goes into I think you already answered this question, which was this labor camp used as a prisoner of war camp during World War II?
Yes, that was the origin of the Glassboro camp, was for German, and it was actually more German and Italians, prisoners of war. And then after the war, these labor camps, these prisoner camps are sold to local governments. So the county board of Glassboro buys the camp, and it becomes the camp for Puerto Rican workers, where they complain to live in prison-like conditions.
Thank you. And then the next question is around how the economic change from agriculture to workers being needed in other industries after World War II. So like the sweatshops and factories in Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, and Hartford. And so I guess, how did that affect or impact also the need for farm workers, and where was there, did it lessen the need for farm workers?
In the United States, or?
Yes, in the United States. Sorry.
What usually happens is, what happened in during the war, a lot of people in the cities in the United States go to the war, right? Men go to the war, and that's what there's this need for workers, workers in industries. The women are incorporated in the industries in the cities and in the rural areas. Then that's why they bring the Mexicans, the British West Indians, and Canadians from Newfoundland. And after the war, the former soldiers with the GI Bill are able to go to study. Many people don't want to go back to work in agriculture, and then is this type of labor regime is instituted, where most of the labor force are seasonal migrant workers. Before the 1940s, people from the cities actually went to the rural areas. From Philadelphia, people were hired and they worked in the farms in southern New Jersey. After the war, those sources of labor end, and that's why the Puerto Ricans become the main source of labor.
Thank you. And then the other question is, if you could talk more about the current state of Puerto Rican farm workers and the impact of, so that's one question. And then also, how did Operation Bootstrap impact this migration of farm workers?
Well, the farm labor program was part of all these attempts to develop Puerto Rico and to modernize Puerto Rico during the late 1940s through the 1960s. The government of Puerto Rico was trying to industrialize the country, bring in manufacture, and so the function of the farm labor program was to provide workers, agricultural workers, jobs, more stable jobs. The idea was that after the harvest in Puerto Rico, the harvest in Puerto Rico runs from the fall and winter in the United States, right? So after December, after February, then the workers could migrate to the Northeast. And harvest vegetables and fruit in the Northeast. That was one of the ideas of the government of Puerto Rico. Another issue was that the government of Puerto Rico was implemented population control policies, right? And it was mass sterilization of women, but it was also fostering migration. And the farm labor program could provided a foothold to Puerto Ricans to migrate. If you didn't have money, you were a farm worker in Puerto Rico, through the farm labor program, you could migrate. The government will provide you the money for the tickets, you will repay it afterward. So what many migrants did was, this was the initial way that they could migrate. And some of them will go back and forth, maybe 2 or 3 years, and then they will bring their families. And that was a way so they could bring all their families. What is the status of current farm workers? There are probably around 2,000 Puerto Rican farm workers. It's not as many like they used to be before. Because the government of Puerto Rico doesn't keep statistics, it's difficult to know how many, but I'm sure that this amount has increased in the last years because of the economic conditions. In 2013, the last time that I visited a labor camp in Oswego. This photo is from Oswego in upstate New York, and the workers are from my hometown in Sidra. And the workers at that time, they were like in their 40s, and they began to migrate after 2006 when the economic crisis began. And they said to me that they could not find construction jobs in Puerto Rico, and that's why they were migrating seasonally to work in the farms. I mean, I have found farms in southern New Jersey where the parents and now they're bringing their children. You know, their parents began in the 1960s to migrate, and now their children do the same thing because they cannot find any other jobs. I met, when I was doing field work, workers that were really young, 19, 18 years old. They couldn't find stable jobs in Puerto Rico, and other were in their early 80s. There were camps with more than 50 Puerto Ricans, especially in southern New Jersey, but most of the camps tend to group like 15 workers. And they are from all over the island, Villalba, Utuado. The people from Utuado tend to migrate to southern New Jersey. The people from the Sidra y Bonito, those places tend to maybe migrate to New Jersey, to Massachusetts, Connecticut, but they're still migrating. And what I imagine is that with Hurricane Maria, many of those that were going back and forth, they just stayed here and brought their families with them.
Thank you. Last two questions. One is, can you talk about the status of Boricuas returning back to Puerto Rico, I guess, to stay? Has there been a large influx of farm workers that have gone back to stay in Puerto Rico?
Well, many went back. So it's difficult to answer that question because we don't really know how many were migrating. What I can tell you is that some estimates, conservative estimates at the during the late 1960s, that says that 60,000 of them were migrating. Others estimates, they say that 100,000 were migrating. But if you go to Puerto Rico in the rural areas and you start asking people, you'll find people that had migrated to the United States throughout their life histories. That's very common. It's not difficult to find former migrant farm workers.
Thank you. And then lastly, just very quickly, they were asking, you had mentioned the co-founder of CATA. Was it Angel Dominguez that you were referring to?
Yes.
That was the question. Thank you so much, Ismael. We really did learn a lot from you. And I think that your presentation really highlighted for us the importance of the solidarity as well, the solidarity aspect, as you pointed out, the way that, workers are exploited is through the system kind of causing these divisions, and then thinking about how to reap the benefits from that later on. And so I think one of the things we always like to talk about is how can we take these things and apply them into the way that we're organizing. And I think one of those main things is really causing to build that solidarity between these different workers' movements.
Yeah, I mean, to have an effective resistance, we have to build bridges of solidarity during times, especially what is coming.
Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you to all who came. Thank you to Babilla as well for coming out and doing interpretation for us. We really appreciate everyone. We did record this. It will be uploaded on to YouTube. And definitely, if folks want to learn more, Ismael does have a book regarding all of this research called Colonial Migrants at the Heart of Empire. So you can find that anywhere online. I don't know, Ismael, if you want to share any other books or things to learn from.
You can also check on my academia edu, because I have some articles about, I have an article that summarizes basically the book, and I have articles about landless workers in Puerto Rico and the history of land distributions in Puerto Rico. Unfortunately, I had so many in-person presentations that were canceled, and I have books at home that are a cheaper price. So, but I cannot mail them to you. So you will have to buy it from the people that don't really like you to buy them. But if you go to the UC Press, the University of California Press, you can buy them through them rather than buying through Amazon. But Amazon is probably easier, but if you can find another way to buy it, it's better.
Right, talking about workers' rights, right?
Yes.
Definitely. So I think that is all.
I'm sorry. Thank you for the invitation.
Of course. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Have a good one and take care. Does anybody have any last closing thoughts from anyone? Oh, yeah, that's a good thing. Thank you, Angel. So just so that folks know, Boricua Resistance is an alliance of different chapters that are organizing the Puerto Rican diaspora and our allies throughout the US. And so we have locations right now in the Pacific Northwest. They just put their email in the chat. We also have a location here in New York City, Chicago also, and Orlando. And so if you are interested in any of that, you can email the email address that sent you out the Zoom info, and we can connect you to the right places. And also if you're somewhere where there is a Puerto Rican population and you want to start a chapter, definitely reach out to us as well, and we can talk to you more about what that looks like. Thank you again to Ismael, to Babilla, and to everyone who came. Have a great time and stay safe.
Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to add nothing real quick. All of the chapters have Facebook pages. and other social media platforms. So you can also look for us there.
Have a good one, everybody. Take care.